Welcome to the Voices of War, a podcast with a simple vision to bring to life the true costs of war through the voices of those who've lived it. I'm your host Maz, and I hope you enjoy this episode. My guest today is Steph Speck. When she was 9, her parents, both teachers, decided to move the family to live in Taree in the Southern Highlands province of Papua New Guinea. Early on after their arrival, a tribal fight was held on the school oval. Someone had killed 3 pigs that had been set aside to pay a bride price, and blood revenge was the only way out. Steph's father made the whole school stand at the windows for 5 minutes and watch as people attacked each other with bows and arrows and machetes. The lesson was clear and seared on Steph's mind for life. Violence is never the solution. War doesn't fix things. Since then, Steph has lived and worked in more than 20 countries, accumulating almost 25 years' experience as a strategy and communications advisor, supporting democratic reform in fragile and conflict-affected settings. Steph's expertise includes the design and programming of cross-government reform strategies, strategic communication advocacy initiatives, public policy development, counter-terrorism communication strategies, government public affairs, and crisis communications. Steph has launched TV channels, including the Middle East's most popular MBC Action, was Deputy Director of the first Palestine Investment Forum, led a US $1 billion government's reform portfolio in Afghanistan, developed maternal health campaigns in the Vietnamese-Chinese border regions, worked to eliminate family voting in Albania, reported on disasters, earning her the Australian Humanitarian Award for her work post the Indian Ocean tsunami, and held several high-level public diplomacy and spokesperson roles, including as senior advisor to the Senior Minister of Afghanistan, the President of Somalia, and the Prime Minister of Iraq. Steph has just finished almost 3 years leading communication and advocacy initiatives for the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction in Geneva. Her biggest communication challenge in recent years has been explaining to her 9-year-old daughter how a world where President Trump can be elected and Yemen ignored can exist. Steph, thank you for joining me. It's a real pleasure to host you on the Voices of War.
Hi, Maz. I'm very, very happy to be here.
And just for context for my audience, I met Steph first in 2018. We worked together on a project in Iraq, and this is where I got to know the fury that Steph possesses and how she does work. Steph, you have one of those absolutely amazing biographies that invites more questions than it answers. So maybe we can start with that first introduction to war in Papua New Guinea. You were 9 years old when you first observed mass violence. Could you describe that scene for us in a little more detail?
Sure. My family, my parents were missionaries, and they literally from one day to the next decided to take us to live in the Southern Highlands of Papua New Guinea in the middle of a very mountainous region in a tribal group called the Huli people. And the Huli people were fighters. That's what they were renowned for. Short, stocky, strong people. And when I went back to Papua New Guinea about 20 years later, when I was working with AusAid, all I had to do was introduce myself as a Highland Mary, and people backed off. So it was really the most formative experience of my life. We were there for 3 years, and we finished school every afternoon at 3, and it got dark at 7. So we were allowed to run wild from 3 till 7. We didn't wear shoes for 3 years. We learnt to hunt. We made banana palm rafts, rafted down rivers. It was a childhood paradise. But there were also really, really tough things, yeah. And living in a group which had not been open to outside access for very long, who were by nature into conflict. And as I described in my bio, that is the first time that I've ever witnessed men fighting men in a horrific way with bows and arrows and machetes. Nothing clean or sober about it. And I really admire my father, although I had no idea why he was doing it at the time. It was truly terrifying because, of course, we didn't know whether they would move from the oval into the school. So there was that hanging over that. But I remember my father in his very grave, serious manner saying, I want everyone to watch this. And so we did. And the memory that I have of that is irrevocably seared in my heart, my mind and my soul. And I remember there was only one takeaway that was possible from that, and that is, this is never, ever going to solve anything, because it just starts a cycle of the next fight and of the next series or story of revenge. And I think at that stage, I thought, this has really spoken to me in all my 9-year-old wisdom.
Yeah.
Maybe there's something here for later on. And I think that's really what set me up on a path of being interested in conflict, interested in places that weren't working so well, and seeing what I could, through my own skill set and passion and energy, do about that.
That's amazing. I love the fact that you can actually reflect on the thoughts and emotions of a 9-year-old. And I frequently speak about this on the podcast. I was 10 when the war in Bosnia broke out. And I still carry and remember that feeling of, in one way, excitement, right? Because I was 10 and I didn't really know what was happening. To me, it was kind of exciting, soldiers, army, and I loved it all. But in another way, I felt a real loss of control and a sense of understanding the world around me, which I think planted the seed also for my own path and my own journey. Mm-hmm. I wonder, what was your dad's intention with, I guess, forcing the whole school to watch? I mean, did he contextualize this as a lesson that he wanted you, and presumably with his local children, or presumably all Papua New Guinean children, and
some Papua New Guinean children, but mostly an international school cohort. My father is very deliberate about everything that he does. A very, very thoughtful man, and he doesn't do anything lightly. So it would not have been it was certainly not in any way meant to be a traumatizing experience for us, probably, or a kind of quick, look at this is interesting. I'm sure my father thought quite quickly but strongly about that moment. And my father is a great lover of peace. He was in his, I guess, early 20s when the Vietnam War and people were being conscripted in Australia. And he and two of his brothers were conscripted. All of them, fortunately, did not have to go to war because they all had terrible knee injuries from playing too much footy.
Right. Okay, yeah.
But I know that forms part of my father's psyche. So I think it was a very deliberate move on his part to show us what happened when people sought to try and fix things through fighting. And I have no doubt that he deliberately chose that, hoping that we would never, ever forget that lesson. And I'm really grateful. I think that many parents now would be horrified to hear that someone did that, because, of course, there's associated trauma with looking at things like that. But I can only be grateful. And I think I would be so bold to say that if I had that opportunity with my own 9-year-old daughter now, I would do the same thing. Yeah. So that she would hopefully learn the same lessons.
Yeah. And I guess the idea of trauma, if things are left to fester, I guess, that's when it really develops into a traumatic experience. But if it's contextualized and explained and
discussed.
Yeah. Exactly.
And I remember we discussed it as a classroom of 9 and 10-year-olds. What did we see? How did we feel? What did we think would happen next? And I think even at that very young age, that very formative stage, we knew what would happen next. Well, someone would come back to get the guy who killed that guy. Yeah. We knew that, as I said earlier, that there's a cycle of violence that's very, very difficult to break out. And I've seen that cycle of violence now in Iraq, Somalia, Afghanistan, Albania, Algeria, Syria, in many places that I've lived and worked since.
It's incredible, and I couldn't agree more. I think it's the tit for tat, and we also know in places like Afghanistan, it is part of the honor code. I mean, it's say the Pashtun Wali. I mean, we know that blood is paid. An indiscretion is paid in blood, and that's not that's perhaps something that we, quote unquote, Westerners don't necessarily understand, but that's infused in just about the roots of just about every society, that revenge in one way or another, whether through sanctions, or through dropping bombs, or through family violence. I mean, that's still if we just think to our own political leaders, or funnily enough, we're speaking on the eve of September 11. That war started as a it was revenge.
It was purely revenge, and revenge in a very funny place. Yeah.
Yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah, exactly.
It was revenge by proxy.
By proxy, that's right. Yeah, and then we went somewhere else as well. While we're at it.
Yeah.
So that really that experience, I can certainly appreciate how they would have set the path for you. But of course, you were only 9 at that point. So how did you then stumble into what has been nearly 25 years of working in some of the craziest parts,
the dodgiest places on the planet?
Yeah. How did you get into that?
Yeah, I didn't set out to do it. I actually wanted to be the world's best opera singer. So I love music. Music is my passion, and I trained to sing. For various reasons, and that's what I did early on in my career. I sang semi-professionally, but I always had a notion that there was more to being applauded, as satisfying as that is. And very early on, I had started working in communications. Again, no background there. I studied literature and philosophy. I knew how to think and write. That was it. But I didn't know anything about comms or marketing or how you change people's mind. But I knew that it was an area that I was interested in. And so all of my learning, the entirety of it has been through doing, through trying, through experimenting, through learning from people on the job, from making mistakes, and then trying to do it better the next time.
The school of life.
Exactly. And I think as Aussies, that's often how we go. So I once saw an advertisement for someone to run a program talking about international aid in Australia, and it turned out it was AusAid. They didn't put their name on the ad, and I went into a job interview, and as I've done many times since then, I listened to the people describe the job, and I thought, that won't work. And I said, I don't think that will work. This is how I would do it. And the poor shocked person on the other end of the coffee table said, oh, okay, well, maybe we could give that a shot. And that started my career with AusAid. And AusAid, I guess the seminal moment of that, there were many, but it was really to talk with the Australian public about the fact that their dollars were doing something else outside the domestic borders. They were making improvements in people's lives in the region, which led back to improved, security outcomes for Australia. Some of those long-winded logical arguments, and I loved it. And then in 2004, on Boxing Day, I was with family in Sydney, and I think we were all glued to the television, as everyone in Australia was, watching the terrible tragedy of the tsunami overtake so many countries in the Indian Ocean. And I rang Canberra and said, you know what, I think you're going to need someone on the ground to tell the story and to show Australians that their aid dollar is making a big difference, and it's not being wasted, it's being used well. Can I go? And I literally got on a plane 2 days later. Qantas baggage handlers very conveniently lost my tent, which I had taken so that I had somewhere to sleep. And I went from Sri Lanka to the Maldives to Banda Aceh and did the circuit a few times over the next 3 or 4 months, basically telling the story of what happened when Australian dollars, go into places like Sri Lanka and Maldives after a natural hazard has hit and destroyed everything that people know and realise. And that gave me this, and I loved it. I knew I could live on anything, anywhere, and tell a story, and that really started my journey of being the person who got sent when things went wrong. That's what opened the doors, actually.
And that would have been an incredible experience. I mean, and wow, talk about a courageous move as well. I mean, to just phone up and say, hey, should I go? Because I suspect you were not actually part of the logistical move.
No.
Your job was, you created your job basically to, hey, let me tell the Australian people what we're actually, look at all the good we're actually doing over there.
Yeah. That's right.
It's I think it's a really powerful tool that we don't necessarily give much credit to, especially when, people don't see what happens with development money or aid money or aid funds. And it's probably something that we I'd hate to say it. I don't think that's something we necessarily do well, but also because there are perhaps even so many questions about, how that money is spent. We don't necessarily rationalize that well, and we can't really account for it all that well. And perhaps that's a separate topic. But communication is, that is your gig.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure is.
But communication is one of those things that we talk about as though we understand what it is, because it is so intuitive. It is almost a bit like culture. It's this kind of big, grand topic that's a little bit slippery. We kind of, we assume we know what it is, but it is an umbrella term. How do you define communication? And I particularly like the fact that, you're a practitioner of communication. You're not about to give me an academic definition of communication, but a practitioner's view. What is communication?
Yeah. And I'll start by, breaking the cardinal rule of comms, and I won't answer the question immediately. But, because, the first thing that comes to mind to me is always bad comms. We all know what bad comms looks like. It looks like, that unintelligible set of instructions you get when you've got to build something, or when you're sitting on a plane and you don't know why it hasn't taken off and the captain is silent, or it's that family conflict, which just results in entrenched positions. We all know what bad comms looks like, and more importantly, what it makes us feel, and therefore how it makes us act or not act. So I think really simply at its heart is communication is about building a connection. Now, strategic communication, which is what I like to think I do, is building a connection that results in a change. So it's moving beyond that very basic part of comms, which is about giving information, to thinking what has to happen in a chain of events to get something to change, either in people's minds or their hearts or the way they live their lives, or at the level in some of the jobs that I've worked in, at a macro level, at a government level. How do you get a government to change its mind so that citizens understand what a government's trying to do, and therefore they embrace reform rather than fight against reform? So strategic comms is comms that builds a connection because it has change as the end goal. And it's crap communications, which I see most of the time, because it never gets to that. It's okay, there's a brochure, there's a website, there's a tweet. And it's kind of like this, this one-way megaphone approach to comms, rather than to this two-way discussion that is at the heart of all good comms.
Yeah, and I guess that leads me to the next point, particularly when you're talking about the kind of macro level strategic communication, government level communication, which is designed to represent the people, presumably, but also connect to the people. Yeah. How do you then, and this is something that I've wrestled with, over many years, to try and understand, because to me, there is marketing in it, there's salesmanship in it, there is making people believe things, to instill a vision, inspire. But how do you link their voices, the people on the ground, particularly in these conflict affected areas where there are thousands of narratives, there are different tribal dynamics, there are different geopolitical dynamics. It seems to me like a exceptionally complex idea to try and move a country forward by giving them some. Do you see what I mean? Like, how do you link the on the ground voice to that strategic picture? Yeah.
Well, I think communications has always been a tool of reform and revolution. You don't get either without comms. But and I believe it was Plato who said that those who tell the stories rule society.
Yeah.
And I think that comms used to be the preserve of the rich and powerful. I mean, you think about it, even 200-300 years ago, you and I probably would not have known what our king or our prime minister looked like. We wouldn't have been privileged enough to have seen the little oil paintings, or to have been able to read or understand what we were seeing. So in the last 20 years, what this extraordinary revolution in terms of social media has brought us, that now just with a phone, I can have a media empire. So communications has fundamentally changed from being something that you owned and controlled through influence and power to something that can be used by anybody, anytime, anywhere, and therefore governments can only seek to influence or leverage. We've moved from controlling to persuading, and that's a totally different level of skill set. And I see that very much in some of the countries I've worked in. Firstly, there's a great deal of risk associated with good comms initially. So many of my first conversations with presidents or prime ministers or ministers are, "Oh, Steph, we don't want to talk about that. What if it goes wrong? Or what if people don't believe us? What if we can't live up to that promise?"
Can you give a conscious of private conversations? But is there any examples that you can give to just to carry through to make your point? Because I think you've seen some amazing things, so it'd be good to hear.
The very first gig I had in Afghanistan was working on a project that was about giving power back to the private sector. So rather than you have in any former communist regime where the state was the employer, it was about saying the private sector has to lift its part of the share too. So you can imagine the government was really hesitant about ceding power, and the private sector was hesitant about what it meant when it took power. So I remember I had a huge fight, both with the people in the fund that we'd set up and the people in the ministries that should benefit from the fund, about putting up a website to say what it was that we wanted to do. And I remember very clearly sitting in a meeting with the head of the fund saying, "Oh, we don't want to put our head, over the parapet." That's what he used. We might get shot at. And I remember very clearly saying, "Yeah, sure, probably we will, but at least we'll see it coming." So for me, it was the very first thing was about transparency, visibility, because trust is what's critical. And when I go into these environments, what I see often, and normally I go into these environments, literally I get a phone call from an unlisted number. "Steph, we've heard you do this kind of stuff. Could you come and give us 6 months and set up a comm structure for us as a new prime minister, as a new president, as a new minister?" And normally I say yes. And normally I have a very tough discussion to say, "Look, you've got to this position because you sold a dream. And probably the dream is not actually realizable." Yeah. So you've said, you've set people's expectations on an upward trajectory. The reality is going to be here or worse, sloping down. For those of you who can't see, I hope I'm doing like a 45-degree angle. Yeah. I'm terrible at maths. You can correct me, Maz.
No, that's spot on.
And in between those two angles, if you can't bring expectations and reality together, you have a deficit of trust. And that's what breaks empires. Because there will always be someone who can come in and fill that void. So often the first conversation I have is about personal trust between me and who's in charge. I have to be able to say what I think is the right way. Maybe I don't get to do it, but I need to be able to say it. And second, we have to have a commitment to, above anything else, being realistic with what we can deliver. You can tell people to go and drink from a well and say that water is healthy, but unless the well is there, people can't drink. So comms has to go hand in hand with the actual practical reforms. And when they are separated, which I see in many places, that the comms sells the dream and the practical reform never happens. Again, you get back into that cycle of mistrust, distrust, and nothing is possible. Can I expand with another example, maybe from Iraq?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So when I worked in Iraq for the second time, and this is where you and I met, it was a really complex situation where Daesh controlled 60% of the country. And of course, Daesh had a massive comms budget. No one knows exactly how much it was, but we know it was tens of millions.
And effective, and very effective.
And effective,
right? Yeah.
Because they sold a vision and they made it come true. Horrific, terrible, as anti-human rights as it was, they made it come true. So people thought, well, there's someone in charge who says what he means and then goes and makes it happen. And if you look at the way that, post-conflict or conflict or fragile states work, it's often been a series of promises that haven't been able to get kept. So when someone comes in who says something as far out as it is and keeps that promise, it actually builds trust.
Better the devil I know, right?
That's exactly right.
It's really what it is.
I know. I steal something, my hand gets chopped off. Or my neighbour, probably more to put it how it actually works. My neighbour steals something from me. He gets his hand chopped off. I quite like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
So So when we came into that situation, Daesh had a clear vision. They had the power and the means and the money to fund achieving that vision and telling people about it. And we were given the task of coming into Iraq and actually helping the government tell its vision in a way that could be believed. And when we got in there, the government wanted to set up its own digital service. Yeah. Social media, complete digital service. And we had to say, actually, we can't do that right now. Firstly, you've got no one to talk to. Secondly, you've got no stories to tell them. And if you start peddling false truths in that environment, you will only undermine yourselves even more. So we had to say, press pause for a moment. And then we had to go through a very rigorous period of research and understanding what is it that was, that people wanted to respond to. What did they want to hear from the government? What would fix their needs? And from that, driving down into 5 key things. Energy. Energy was above anything else. People wanted to know that their lights would come on and the AC would work, during 55-degree days. And we had to build out an audience. So we knew that the only stories we could tell, going back to that, those who tell stories rule society, the only stories we could tell were not of government successes, but were of personal successes that everyday Iraqis had brought to fruition in their own lives. We told stories of people, the baker on the corner who had looked after, poor people in his neighbourhood by baking bread for free, and then next year had been able to install a new oven and had increased efficiency. The woman who, under the rule of Daesh, had not been able to leave her home, chose not to leave her home, actually, because she refused to be completely covered, who had learnt 5 languages over Skype. Those stories of everyday triumphs that said that, Iraq, we're in this together and we've got this together. And for me, that was an extraordinary period in Iraq's history to live through, to witness, to serve, seeing that you could tell stories of people doing ordinary things that made a difference for them, their families and their communities. And then broaden that out to say, well, the government wants to do more of that. And actually then work very hard with sometimes very reluctant ministers who wanted to tell the big stories. Said, no.
Yeah, not yet.
We can't tell this story, of the new power field in Basra. It doesn't exist. We can tell a story of subsidising diesel fuel for generators, so that people can afford it. So scale, truth, and transparency became the way that we did that comms. And I think, what delights me now is to see very dear colleagues who we worked with not only have had success in that environment, but have gone on to build their own businesses because of, what we learned together and be successful in a commercial marketplace. And that's a great story of development done right, because we took the time to pause, listen, learn, and guide, to development leading to increased skills and capacity that allow people to go up and set up their own fantastic businesses doing incredible comms and advertising. Yeah.
And it's all from telling stories of the people on the ground, those who are ultimately paying the price for all of it, and making them realize that they are being heard and that their stories matter. But I think it also builds a natural connection to the everyday person. When you hear an everyday and see an everyday person, you connect with that rather than seeing the pompous train of glory, that is usually political leadership, particularly, in countries like Iraq, and I'll also put
a few other places closer to home.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's right. So it's certainly not an isolated incident, but to actually see the people, and I think it was the campaign was for a new Iraq, if I recall, at least one of them. I do remember how impactful those stories were and how well made it was. It wasn't a half-assed effort. The production piece was a really strong production, which and I think again that's an important aspect, right? I mean, if you're going to do this, you've got to do it right.
You must never compromise. You must never ever compromise. And I've never bought into that. Oh, we can only do it this way because it's 55 degrees, because the power went out, because maybe people haven't had the benefit of being taught. That they're just excuses. Yes, the power can go out. Yes, it can be 55. Yes, there can be an earthquake. But who cares actually?
Yeah.
There should be no excuses made for lack of quality. I'm a big believer that whatever you can do in places where you think it's easy to do it, you can also do in places where maybe there are some other interesting things that get in the way. So a commitment to quality is also a trademark.
Absolutely. I guess my question would be, and this is the cynic in me, what is the difference between, arguably manipulation on behalf of a government, or, what we would call, in military intelligence speak, psychological operations, where you're trying to shape and influence a population towards, a military end state. In this case, it would be to a government's end state. And we also know, certainly in many parts of the world, autocratic regimes certainly live by the credo of manipulating the population and, exploiting ultimately through that manipulation.
Mm-hmm.
How would you answer a skeptic about Iraq in particular, where, we're still seeing, and I've just recently, I just recently interviewed our good old friend Ghassan, who,
yes.
we know well.
I heard that, yes.
Yeah. So, and he made the point quite clearly. I mean, Iraq now is more divided than ever was. He's in a way also predicting the redrawing of maps around Iraq, which again just goes to that point that the skeptic could very easily say, okay, how can I know that that's not just government manipulation? And, if the government was so fantastic and doing all these great things, then why is the country falling apart, basically?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an excellent question. There's a couple of ways of answering that. One is around attribution. I think attribution is the key difference between the kind of spook comms, the under-the-table comms, and the full-on in-your-face government in the sun communications, as I would call it. So I think attribution is absolutely critical. You, as a person, as a citizen, I need to know who said it, when they said it, where they said it, and that line needs to be very, very clear. And I think particularly in many cases which have been ruled by dictators, dreadful people who have used state-owned media as their own personal PR machine. You've got to make it a cut. And that is why in places like Iraq, it's much better to be slower to talk about what is possible than to oversell at the beginning. And that's a very difficult thing to tell to a government. If a president's just been elected or a prime minister has just got in, to say pause. Yeah. While we get things right, while we build the wells that we're going to go and help people to drink from later on. So I think it's firstly the attribution, secondly the ability to say pause, slow down, what's actually measurable, visible, apparent. And in Iraq we had to wait essentially 10, 11 months till we could get to that stage. And then it was, again, the small stories, as I said, about subsidized fuel rather than a power plant. In Somalia, it was around things we couldn't talk about, federalism or a constitution or one person, one vote at the beginning of my work in Somalia. We had to talk about community level healing, community level justice, community level service provision as the building block. We couldn't sell a national dream. There was no nation. Yeah. The pressure that you often get that distorts that and actually gets in the way is the pressure in my experience, lived experience in many places, is the international aid architecture that comes in all guns blazing, all funds blazing, and wants very quick, rapid change to demonstrate their own effectiveness and the power of their brand. But also, I mean, they're well motivated, if not well executed. And
I love that, the power of their own brand. I'll come back to that. I think that's such an amazing point, but I'll come back to that. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just kind of putting a bookmark on that.
So many times, again, in my experience, I've sat in meetings with heads of state and ambassadors or heads of multilateral organizations who've come in and promised the world. I remember a classic example in Afghanistan, the World Bank. We were going through a law and justice reform program. And for the first time, actually, the Afghan government had put together a team of ministries, advisors, people like me who are not sitting in a donor compound somewhere, but who are living and walking the streets, embedded in ministries, who said to donors, wait, you have to give us 18 months to develop our own strategies. We know what you want to do, but we're going to tell you what we want to do. That issue of sovereignty is always at stake. And I've staked my career on defending sovereignty of different places and nations. And in Afghanistan, the World Bank had a fantastic proposal for the law and justice sector. One of the big issues was getting people to turn up for their court appearances. So I think something like 70% of court cases were never heard because people didn't come. And so the World Bank wanted to build, I think, I may have this amount incorrect, but I just want to prove, I want to make the point of tens of millions, if not at least more than 100 million, to put in a digital court reminder system. And they had the money, they had the program. And I remember speaking with the Minister of Justice, and he said, Steph, we want paper. I said, what do you mean paper? He said, you know that paper that has the black ink thing underneath it, so when you write on the first bit, it goes through to the second bit? Yeah. And we reckon that'll cost us about 20,000. We need 10,000 of those booklets, and we need them given to the courtrooms. Yeah, because firstly, the courtrooms don't have power. And if they do have power, then they're a target for the Taliban to come and cut off the power. So we don't want to increase the risk of, trying to set up a verifiable justice system. Can you give us paper? Yeah, and this is the discussion I've had many, many times of sitting in a government office, understanding the government perspective, and having to go and then fight that fight with donors who have something brilliant, probably better, but just not suitable. And that happens not just with practical things like law and justice reform, but on the comms side as well. So often there's comms budget around doing beautiful films or booklets or publications or having an event. But again, if they don't serve to shore up the country or to give confidence, increase confidence of citizens in their own government, they are a waste of time. And I think in my experience, many of these initiatives, I think, have proven to be a waste of time because they've not sat, pressed pause, learned and listened.
And understood where they're actually operating. I mean, and that speaks to so many different points, but I really like that. I just want to pick up on that power of their own brand, because I think that's a fundamental weakness in the way we interact on the global stage. We profess values, but we work for interests, right? And that to me is a continuous clash in my mind, and one that it strikes me as philosophically, ethically, one that we just don't unpack sufficiently, right? So, and when you say the power of their own brand, that to me says, I've got my own interests at heart here. This is what my brand needs to stand up for. This is what I'm trying to sell, not necessarily as a product, but I'm selling my brand, my power, my soft power, my hard power, whatever it is. That's my brand. So therefore, it is backed by my own interests.
Yes.
Whilst I'm espousing domestically and internationally values to uphold, we're going to go to Afghanistan and give women the vote. We're going to liberate. We're going to give equality. We're going to, etc., democratize, etc., etc., etc. But those are continuously in clash, because if you already know what story you're going to, quote unquote, sell, then of course you're not going to ask the Afghan women, what does equality look like to you? I'm going to come in with my brand of equality. I know the answer. I know the solution. Here it is. And that's why we, and I really, really like that point, World Bank. I mean, the World Bank, if the World Bank can't allocate people to analyze sufficiently the ecosystem, quote unquote, that it's operating in, like Afghanistan, to not realize that, hey, computer systems, there might be a bridge too far.
Yes.
Like, to me,
at this stage.
Yeah, at this stage, exactly. And, 30, 40, 50, I don't know, ever down the track, sure. But let's start that process. And also, there's so many questions that go with that. Do you have enough trained people in it? Do you have enough life through, support for all the equipment and all the tons of questions that come with it? But perhaps most importantly, have we actually asked the people? What do they think?
Yeah. Have we sat on the ground long enough? And I think, and don't get me wrong, I think there are many people who do and have, including in the World Bank and including in many branches of the UN, people who've given their lives to countries in many ways, and the lives of their families too. I think there's a classic story that I'd like to tell to illustrate this. When I first arrived in Somalia, to work with the president there as his strategic advisor for communications. The president had never been a president, had never been in politics. He was an educator, a well-renowned, well-loved educator, and who came to power to his own surprise, and had his own very clear domestic agenda for the country, which was very, very quickly overshadowed by what donors wanted to do. Then I think it may have been my second day in Mogadishu. I was staying in Villa Somalia, the presidential compound. It's not walled up behind the UN's and AFRICOM's thousands of soldiers on the UN compound, but out in the city. And I was asked to go and have lunch with the president. And as I walked through the compound, you get into sort of progressive layers of tightening security. And right from the little room that I was staying in, there'd been an old woman in front of me, and she had a chicken under each arm. And she was walking ahead of me. And as we got further and deeper into the compound, she kept on walking. And as we got to the fence around the president's house, where all of his real internal security guys were, she went through that gate too. And I thought, oh my goodness, have I just been rude to the president's mom? Have I just, this little old lady with 2 chickens has just walked through all the layers of security. She must be someone. Yeah. And I've just, trailed her rather than catching up to say hello and greet her properly. And I had to sit outside and wait because the woman was ushered into the president's house. I thought, oh my goodness, I really have been rude. And so his guard said to me, you just need to wait, Stephanie, just sit outside for a while. And I waited for a while, and then I went in to the president's house, and we had lunch. And as I came back out again, I said to the guards on the door, oh, who was the old woman with the chickens? I'm very sorry if I was, if I wasn't polite and to greet. They said, oh, we don't know. That's just some woman from the city. And I said, well, what was she doing here? And he said, well, she used to have 5 chickens and her neighbour stole 3 of them. And she's only got 2 left. And she came here to ask the president if he would get the other 3 back for her. And that was my welcome to Somalia moment. And I looked at the guard, and the guard said, yes, of course he will do this. And I thought, what on earth do we have to offer? This is democracy at work. Here is an old woman, anybody who accessed the president, directly voiced her wish, and he made it happen for her. What on earth did we have to offer in that very one-on-one level of democracy? I know who's in charge. I know I can talk to him, and I know he's going to help me. How many other layers did we then succeed, in the next 10, 11 years of overlaying that very basic principle of access to justice from the person who's in charge with all of our programs and our multi-million dollars and the compounds and the walls that we erected to distance the women who should be able to talk to the person who's in charge? And that for me was the model of, at every point, am I building barriers? Am I blowing them up? Or maintaining that free pathway.
Am I falling for the technocrat trap, right? The idea that I have a well thought out technical solution to this problem. It's about design, and we've learned it in our universities, etc.
Yes. Yeah, or at worst, we did it in Afghanistan, and now we're just going to do control, alt, replace, and substitute Somalia, Syria, Yemen in its place. And I find it distressing, the kind of bureaucratic mythology that rises in these places, that it's very difficult to get things done. I think we make it difficult to get things done. The first thing the UN often does is to build a compound.
And
there's immediately then a castle mentality that sets in. And when you have people who, in Somalia who had to seek special access to go to a place where they used to be able to run on the beach, then something is going to undermine something sooner or later.
And I think it also instills a mental image of the place you're in. It alienates you, distances you as the person on the ground. And I couldn't agree more with you. The hundreds of people that I've met in various industries, whether military or development, well-intentioned, absolutely, soul of the earth type people who are dedicating their lives, careers to make someone else's life better. And I certainly wouldn't cast a shadow on them at all. But oftentimes, because of the infrastructure that we exist within, we become part of the problem as opposed to solution. And I'm not saying all of us, but the general image. And I just think back to my own experiences. Having deployed as a military person, staying on bases, but then going to Iraq as a civilian, and then for the first time going into Baghdad city for a coffee.
Or shisha.
Yeah, or shisha. What? Hold on. Can I really do this? Hold on. How will I? Won't somebody take me hostage? Yeah, but that's because of this implanted almost fear of the place that I'm going to, because of the narrative and the understanding that I have of oftentimes very limited understanding of the conflict that I'm in, but because of these symbols and the images of up-armored vehicles, of gates, of 3-4 searches. I mean, just thinking back how to get onto the IZ. I mean, my God, I mean, you have to plan your meetings, you have to leave an hour beforehand just to account for all the searches.
That's right.
Arguably necessary, right? But, I also don't know if it's as we would say, it's a self-leaking ice cream, right? You're perpetuating the problem because you're creating so many barriers as well.
That's right. And therefore, I think with comms, that's that first question you have to ask: is what I'm doing, I'm picking, unpacking, blowing up those barriers, or adding more layers? I think that's the guiding question in countries where there are physical, not just virtual barriers in front of people. Another, and I think too, the narrative, reworking the narrative is critical too. I mean, Somalia was, that's Black Hawk Down. Everyone feels like they know Somalia a bit, because of, they've seen the terrible things that have happened there. But Somalia also has the longest coastline in Africa, the fastest growing youth population. It has rivers, agricultural, entrepreneurial people. Why shouldn't it be the next biggest thing? Yeah. It's this narrative that we tell, that we reinforce by barriers, by structures, by institutions, by not listening, by denying sovereignty, that often creates more problems. I remember taking the president once to meet the head of Transparency International, because Somalia always was right down the bottom of any Transparency International list for corruption. Yeah. I remember in that meeting saying, look, the Somali government at that time had, and again, I won't get the figures exactly right, but they'll serve a purpose, had a recurring annual domestic budget of around $14 million. That was it. Yeah. And on the other side of the fence for the international community, they had a recurring annual domestic budget of around $1 billion. Now, where was corruption most likely to take place? On the side of the fence that had $14 million, or on the side of the fence that had access to $1 billion, and the scale of it? And I remember we asked the head of Transparency International's question, said, fundamentally, some of these indexes that only serve to reinforce narrative, to cut off foreign direct investment, to make it more difficult to do business, have to be redressed in the light of reality, of actually who's got what and where does it go and who has access to it. And I think that's also been part of my comms career. How do you reset the narrative? How do you really tell the stories of what's actually happening without the filtered, branded background?
Yeah, and the simplicity of it. And I think that's the other trap. I mean, because, and in many ways I can also understand it, right? Domestic audiences, they want simple. We don't have the time to, analyze and understand the complexity of what the Taliban is, right? Taliban, the guys that are shooting at us, they're the bad guys, they're all Taliban, right? But it also does a disservice when we talk about, again, because we're talking, and this is where I want to come back to the idea, and I really want to get your thoughts on this idea of interests versus values. How do you tackle that challenge? Because I'm sure, as strategic communications, that is a big, because you are still representing a brand, whether it's the government, or the president or whoever that brand is, how do you unpack, or how do you challenge, how do you push back when interests override values, which I'm sure, happens all the time?
Yes. It goes back to who tells the stories, where do those stories originate, and who tells the stories? I hate this expression, we're working to give women a voice, or we're working to give X, Y, Z group a voice. Everyone has a voice. What we should be doing is giving access for people to hear that voice through different platforms. And this is what I love. As much as I hate social media, what I love about it is that it has, anybody can tell a story anytime. I don't need traditional media. I don't need to spend a big budget on things. I don't need to fly a film crew in. So what I'm really impressed about, initiatives that I see which are telling people's own stories through their own voices. And there are many of those where you provide technology, a platform, and then let people go for it. They're the stories that we need to hear more of. They're the stories at the moment with Afghanistan. We're hearing a Kabul story. We are not hearing the story from the rest of the country. Those stories will serve to help us either fuel us to greater efforts or to recalibrate what we need to do. But for me, it's about who tells the stories and where do they get to tell them. And my job as a communicator used to be telling those stories on behalf of other people. A very colonial, patronizing, self-serving way. And I find that still often how donors work. But I think we're getting closer to saying we don't need to tell anyone's stories. Everyone can tell their own. We just need to provide a way for that story to be heard and listened to.
So how do you then, and I'll just go back to the point you said about it's now about persuasion, because everybody has basically a megaphone in their pocket. What role do you see social media companies have from this perspective, right? Because we know indisputably that social media companies, in some cases, have been quite the tools that they've created have become tools of genocide in some instances.
So they're not altruistic, are they?
Exactly, right.
They're to make their owners money.
The business model of itself is, the attention economy where, I need eyeballs and scandal gets eyeballs on that platform. And therefore, this is why we have the algorithms that create, stovepiping and and I love Zainab Tufekci, I think she did the research on YouTube, right? If you start watching, just Googling moderate Islam to find out about the 5 pillars of Islam, by the, I don't know, I'm making up figures here, but by the 30th video that you kind of follow down that rabbit hole, you'll be learning how to make suicide vests, right? So the algorithms are designed to get you down the rabbit hole of more and more extreme. And the same happens with Facebook, with Twitter. The algorithms are such that, you start creating your own echo chamber. A like-minded people will group, and therefore you ultimately, if you depending, and we spoke about this offline about conspiracy theories. Depending on how far down you go down that rabbit hole, there's absolutely no chance. Even though you have this powerful tool to speak and connect to the most diverse voices, the tool itself is designed in such a way
funnels you somewhere else.
Funnels you. So how do you? So from particularly from a strategic comms perspective, what do you see as the role of social media organizations in combating this, challenging this? Can they change? I mean, can we put pressure on them? I mean, what do we do?
I think we must. Yeah, I think we must put pressure. And this is not so that we get a more sanitized feed or that we're only fed, cat pictures and dog pictures, but that we don't allow ourselves to be funneled because an algorithm is taking us to where we're going to buy something. Ultimately, that's what algorithms do. They expose you to things so that you purchase. You are, as we all know from watching all the Netflix documentaries, you are the product. I think that's, yes. I don't have a magic wand. I actually don't know what the way out of that is, because it's clear that things are only sustained through profit generally. And that's not a world that development plays in. I wish it did more of that it set up things for a profit trajectory so it could hand over and switch. But we don't. That's not how development thinks at the moment, sadly. So I think with social media companies, I think it's a delicate balancing act between freedom of expression, allowing people to say whatever they want, whenever they want. That must be defended at all costs, because that's what people like Taliban, Daesh hate, with a responsibility that people are either exposed to different voices, that there is a way in which that echo chamber, that permanent echo chamber, could be broken. And I think that's probably about being tricky with algorithms or being innovative with algorithms that say every now and then we're going to switch it up. But it's also about us as consumers being very mindful. When I wake up in the morning, I read the New York Times, The Age, The Australian, and BBC. Do I read Al Jazeera? Do I switch on Al Arabiya? Where else am I consuming content from? And that's why I'm delighted at the breadth now that we have access to. But as a consumer, it's not just me. We have rights and responsibilities. And I need to, as a consumer, challenge my own viewing, listening, reading habits as well and take responsibility.
Yeah.
And then I think there's a role for governments to step in and really get to the heart of algorithms, commercial realities, and say, what can we do as a regulatory authority to ensure that there's a little bit of break up here?
Yeah.
Or that at least there are systems in place that allow us to say, these are the limits around what can be seen, what can be said.
Yeah, because I agree 100%. I mean, I think whilst I wholeheartedly agree that responsibility lies with the individual and the onus is on us to, open up different browsers and look at different, media outlets and see what they're saying to try and get some diversity of thought, to challenge our own confirmation bias, because that's what will drive how and that's what drives, and we see this all the time. We see this now with vaccinations and whatnot. We see it in politics, with US a prime example, the stolen election and so on. If you believe a story, you will find information that confirms it, but it takes humility and courage to step outside of that. Now, but one of the things that I find challenging is that I just don't know, because I'm a strong believer that the environment shapes what we do. If my environment is such that I don't get exposure to other news media, I don't get exposure to other opinions, the chance of me actually stepping, for hitting some sort of mental bumper to tell me, hey, actually, I should look outside of this, I find this to be rather unlikely, unless, and this is where I think regulation comes into play, particularly with social media, unless the guardrails exist that will force me or force the architecture through which I consume information, force me to look at other opinions, right? If the choice is only up to me, I don't have that much faith in human autonomy or
it's uncomfortable.
Yeah. But also we know that we're not as autonomous or rational, as we'd like to be, as we'd like to think we are. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why I think it has to be that holy trinity between individual as consumer, government as regulatory authority, and social media businesses as commercial realities. How does that triangle work, and how do we interact in a healthy way? And I wouldn't use the word force. I would use the word opportunity. What opportunity can regulatory authorities provide to deepen exposure to? And again, for me, it comes back to my own sense check that I always do for myself is, who told that story? Was that an Afghan woman on the streets of Kabul or Jalalabad or Kandahar telling that story? Was that a white Western face that I saw? Yeah. Where does that authenticity come from? Now, of course, there are problems. Maybe Afghan women are not able to tell the story in that place at that time. Then we should be working to change that. But my own sense check is, who told that story? And so one of the things that I'm proud about is over the last few years at the UN is helping to support a team of African journalists called Diraj to tell their own stories of what disaster risk reduction and resilience building looks like in different countries in Africa. And I think they're the kind of initiatives that we should do more of, not coming in with our set pieces or the narratives that we have as donors, as agencies, but going back to who tells the story and how do we enable that. They're the stories I want to listen to, because they're the stories that understand the nuances and know how to do something about it that's lasting and sustainable when we've all packed up and gone home.
Yeah. And I think it undermines that. I mean, I think we're all growing accustomed to, and I mean, that is the consequence of, the last 30 years, particularly in the West. We've lost faith in our leaders, in the institutions, in the system, whether that be Brexit, whether that be Trump, these are all consequences of significant portions of the population being left behind, which is what you were talking about before, your 45-degree angle gap between the dream that was sold, at the polling booth, between reality, and I think by actually slowing down and realizing, hold on, people aren't stupid. People are starting to realize, this is where this is the drain the swamp idea, right? I mean, and you can almost understand that, because we've been quote unquote fed lies, although they might have been well intentioned at the time. They've proven to not have eventuated. Now the same happens, when we go overseas and when we try to sell a conflict affected state, nation. Well, here's your dream of democracy, and here's how we're going to solve it. But
here's your constitution written in English by an expert in Washington.
Exactly. Exactly like Bosnia, right? The Dayton Peace Accords. Annex D is the constitution written in English.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Which is sure good for let's stop the killing, but come on, it again removes the actual local context from any,
and it removes the responsibility too, doesn't it? That's the dangerous thing, I think, because I think it's then very easy for then the people who are on the ground, the national leaders. We didn't write that, and that's true.
Yeah.
So it's actually a very, very dangerous activity to engage in. Or you'll find that when it's translated, that some things change. Yeah. Because actually that first English constitution didn't fit the cultural sensitivities or the cultural context at the time. And so in the translation, certain things slipped. I've seen that happen as well. And I think so these are things that we insist on doing time and time again. And they're not rocket science.
What do you think is the fundamental mistake underpinning this? Have you been able to zero in on 1, 2, 3 key things that you have realized we just keep doing the same mistake again? There's some kind of fundamental principles.
That's a massive, massive question. Again, going back to my own experience, because this is not something that I study or have spent years refining through research. It's what I've seen on the ground. It comes back to what we've talked about throughout the entire conversation. It's that moment of pressing pause and opening one's eyes to the situation in which you're in, not the situation you were in 10 years ago, 5 years ago in a different country. Someone once said to me, don't come to Cairo if you don't love the dust. And for me, it's pressing pause, it's opening eyes with actually a deep concern and consideration and love for the very tricky people and the very tricky situation in which you're now, and having the humility to come into a meeting and say, we're here to ask what you think you need. And you know what we're going to do? We're going to commit for the next 3 years to doing what you think you need. And sometimes it's going to sound like it's going to be crazy.
Yeah.
But actually, we're going to listen to you. I saw that once again in Afghanistan, sitting down with the Minister of Finance to go through the budget for law and justice. The stationary budget was something like $20 million, and we couldn't understand why a stationary budget was so high. And as we went through line by line, we saw that it included like 100 RPG launches. Why do you need grenade launchers in the law and justice stationary budget? They said, well, we need them to defend the courthouses against the Taliban. Now, that would have been a very easy thing for someone to say, that's
delete
not your job.
Line.
And delete that line. Or, as it turned out, a very wise person said, okay, you've said this is a fundamental need. This is what gives your lawyers the confidence to come to court, to prosecute, to listen, to, defend. If that's the kind of security you need to enable law and justice to work in this country, we're going to deliver it. Yeah, good on the US government at that juncture. And it's that ability to say, it sounds crazy, it seems crazy, you know what? We're going to give it a go. I hear so many stories about we can't do that because they're corrupt. No. What that means is actually we haven't set up proper systems and processes that protect things from being corrupt. And that is very easy to do nowadays. Yeah. To set up online and digital systems that track everything. There is no excuse to say we can't do that because there's a risk of corruption. There should be very little risk of corruption. Of course, where there are people, there will always be dodgy people. But that's our laziness getting into the picture. The president of Somalia always said, And he was often ridiculed for this, and I could never understand why. It's like a plumber coming to fix a pipe in your house to stop it leaking. You've got to, at some stage, turn the tap on to see if it was fixed. Yeah. And donors seem to be very, very reluctant to turn the tap on. Either they don't have confidence in their own systems processes, or they're afraid of letting go and ceding control. And I think it's a juggling act between the two. There are very great things that have happened with development. We've seen rates of poverty across the world go down. We've seen more girls in school. We've seen maternal health flourish. We're seeing many incredible things happen. But fundamentally, we don't take the time to listen, to learn, and to love the people in the situation we're going into, to give us the humility to say we may not have all the answers.
Yeah, I think, again, it speaks so much to me, and it again is just another piece of the puzzle in my mind in this dichotomy between interests and values. I can't not ask you, given your intimate involvement in Afghanistan, about the current situation. What's your thoughts?
It's very difficult to speak without a great deal of emotion, so which I won't apologise for. I left Afghanistan when I was 6 months pregnant because my medical insurance refused to pay for me to be there any longer. It's a very, very special place for me because of the people I know and the people I've met and the stories that I've heard. I am deeply disturbed by both the absence of leadership from the Afghan government and the way in which the withdrawal was handled, and the gross arrogance and protectiveness and nationalism that I see on display from many countries around the world who could easily open doors to let people who've served us, who need another opportunity to continue their lives and their families' lives. I cannot understand this reluctance to help and serve. We are all, at one stage in our lives, migrants and nomads, all of us. And we need to give the people who need a second chance the honour and respect that they deserve. I'm deeply ashamed at the actions of the UN. I know that many of the UN leadership in country positions fled and left the country and left national staff there, and then issued irresponsible messages, about what they should do if the Taliban comes looking for them, which is happening. We know that. And I think for the UN to have any shred of credibility, it must look after its national staff. It must now decide where are the limits for its engagement with the Taliban. Are they humanitarian limits? Are they in the development field? And I would hope that the Secretary General uses his influence as he can and could and should to make sure that countries around the world open their doors to accept people who can't have a decent standard or opportunity to stay alive in Afghanistan, to find somewhere else.
I think that's the point, to stay alive, right? We're not talking about economic well-being. We're talking about keeping their head on their freaking shoulders. This is...
I have friends who've sent their daughters away, hiding in different places because they will get taken by the Taliban. I'm the mother of a 9-year-old. For me, that rips my heart apart. Or for colleagues of mine who cannot have money to give to buy food for their families. And we're saying it's difficult to look after those people? No. And then again, as an individual, what am I doing? Yeah, it comes, I can't just point the finger, that's that great Arabic saying, you point one finger at someone else and 3 fingers point back towards yourself. What am I doing? I have to question myself every day. Am I doing enough to use my voice, to ask politicians to do the right thing, to use the privilege I have of where I am and the money I earn to make a difference on the ground? We have to ask ourselves, what are we doing about this? We can't be outraged and not active.
And conscious of the time, I want to bring us to where we started. You said that violence is never the answer. War doesn't get any solutions. What is a solution here? How do we solve this problem, right? As in, and I'm talking about, for example, the Taliban, and we're seeing dozens of videos now of, just the gross abuses of human rights that are just rife, not just in Kabul, but, even worse in other districts and regions of Afghanistan. I mean, what do we do? How do you, what's the communications plan there? You know what I mean? And I'm not trying to be cynical, nor am I, I don't know what the answer is. I really don't. I think I'm as close to a pacifist as somebody wearing a uniform can be.
Yes.
But I'm a little bit at a loss of, ideas.
I don't know either. All I can think, and I don't think anybody does at all. I think what gives me some measure of joy is that things have changed so irrevocably in Afghanistan with people having access to social media. I have no doubt that fuels and empowers the women on their marches in Kabul, because it makes them visible. And when things are visible, they cannot be ignored. Well, we've seen other places where things are visible and ignored. I hope we've learned lessons from the Balkans, from Rwanda, from many, many, many places. What gives me joy is that the Taliban must be very, very scared that they are now having to govern a people who have their own way of expressing what they want and getting it. And I hope that strikes fear into their hearts. And I hope that the people of Afghanistan continue to use the means that they have, as they feel safe to do so, to protest. And we should be doing everything we can to protect and give access to those rights of protest. Beyond that, from a communications angle, I don't have any other $1 million answers apart from the fact that I'm given joy by the fact that technology will enable people to say and what they want to say, to be heard and to be made visible.
Yeah. I recently interviewed Sahar, a young Afghan who now studies in King's College in London. She was a filmmaker initially, but now she's a vocal activist and with strong links to Kabul, quite a powerful, impactful story. And she is somewhat hopeful that that same message you've just made about social media, about the world seeing what's happening on the ground through the technology that's available. But I think she also made a really sad point that the louder Afghans scream, the more deaf the world grows, which to me is, I really hope that's not the case. But I also somehow get the sense that, there's a lot of truth in what she says. And it's almost like, it's just too big a problem. 24-hour news cycle. Let's start talking about something else, which saddens
compassion
me.
Fatigue.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it really.
I have more hope than that because when I first started this kind of international career, a friend, shout out to Julian Simon Good in Canberra, gave me a little card that I still have in my wallet. It must be probably almost 20 years old now. And it's the story of someone walking along the beach and picking up a starfish and throwing it back into the ocean. Yeah. And a very cynical person walking along saying, there are thousands of starfish on the beach. What do you he said, no, but I made a difference to this starfish. It may sound a little naive. It may sound a little blah, blah, hippie-ish, but it's true. Actually, all we need is the courage and conviction and conscience of a few individuals. That's the power of communications, to harness the power of individuals to change things for other people. So the world may ignore, but I have full confidence that there will be people like you, like the people you work with, like the people we've seen, come to the fore over the past couple of weeks, who will not give up, who will do the right thing. And they're the people we need to embrace, support, and give airtime to, so that they can continue doing their bit to change things. The world can ignore it, but there will be one or two good people. And I'm sure someone famous made a good comment about that one day, which I can't remember. But I believe that. Without that, I would lose confidence. I
think that is a perfect note to end this on. It's an optimistic note that I think is appropriate. Steph, it has been an absolute pleasure. I'm in awe of everything you've done and what you do. I think you have energy that I've rarely seen surpassed, and I congratulate you on that. And I really look forward to seeing what you get up to next. I know that you're coming back to Australia, so yes, very much looking forward to having you back home and seeing what you get up to next. But between now and then, thank you so much for your time. I've really, really enjoyed this.
Me too. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Voices of War. You can access all episodes on www.thevoicesofwar.com or by subscribing wherever you get your favourite podcasts. And while you're there, please give us a review, as we'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to recommend a guest for the show, you can reach me on info@thevoicesofwar.com.